Right, hello, welcome
Hello.
to Mudlarking. Well, it's not live anymore because I've decided to pre-record because the last time we tried to talk, it all went a bit tick-tong, didn't it? And
It did.
we lost everybody. So we're doing it again and we're pre-recording this so that we don't lose each other and we can have a good old natter. So thank you so much for coming, Damian. Um,
Pleasure.
for anybody else who's tuning in, today's guest is Damian Barr, who is the author of You Will Be Safe Here, which I absolutely adored. I loved your book.
Thank you very much.
And at this point, I would hold it up if I could, but my mother has borrowed it and she hasn't given it back. And it's probably halfway around the WI somewhere in deepest, darkest Surrey. So apologies for that.
That's the best. That is the best. The WI is one of the kind of forces for spreading literary love in the UK. So happily though, I have my paperback. There you go. Look at that. As if by magic. As if by magic. There's the paperback. Which is has a scene from the second part of the novel. So, you know, the novel set in South Africa in 1900 and now, and this is from the contemporary part of the novel. This is the character Willem, who actually, if you look at that picture and cast your mind back, not that long ago to when I was a teenager, that boy looks really like me at that age in my life. It was because we've got the same publisher and they make beautiful books, don't they?
They do such great jackets.
Gorgeous jackets. It's one of the reasons I chose Bloomsbury, and they sent this to me, and I actually thought that is spooky. How like me in a weird way as even though the character's not me at all. So anyway, yes, they make beautiful jackets, and they're a wonderful publisher. So anyway, I'm glad you loved the book. I did.
I loved the book. Could you give us just a little brief sort of like synopsis of what it's about?
Sure. Well, it's set entirely in South Africa. It's partly historic, so it's set during 1900, during the Boer War, the Second Boer War, and it's set now, and it follows two sets of people who are forced by circumstances into sort of prison camps, if you like, into situations of great adversity, and who have to find hope, find love, find friendship, and survive. So the early part of the book is a diary written by a woman called Sarah van der Walt. She is watching from her farm with her son Fred, her wee boy. She's looking out at the horizon as these pillars of smoke get closer, and these pillars of smoke are the English burning the farms of South Africa. This is a policy called scorched earth. We use this term all the time. We don't think about it being a real thing. It's not just a metaphor. The earth was scorched. The British came along. They killed all the animals on these farms to try and defeat these two tiny nations of farmers who were beating an empire. Mm-hmm. And they scorched the earth. They actually ploughed salt into the soil so nothing would grow there afterwards. And they did this to break up the commando units of Boer, which just means farmer in Dutch, soldiers. And they did this to try and win this war. And the whole empire descended on South Africa. And having created a homeless nation of women and children, the British concentrated these people into camps, which is really simply where you get the origin in English of the words concentration camp, which when you realise that is terrifying. It's a concentration of people into an area. And these camps, there were 40 odd white camps, 40 odd black camps, because black people and white people were separated. And so our character Sarah is hauled off. She watches as her home is blown up, and she's hauled off on an open cart and then on a train to these camps, where she's forced to share a tent with people. She's never had neighbours before, and now she's sharing a tent, and she's there with her son, and she's forced to survive. And these camps, the rations were minimal, conditions were squalid and horrific, and more women and children died in those camps than soldiers died on both sides of the war. So just think about that for a second, what that does to a country, the psychology of a country. And so it's a story. The first part of the book is historic. It's written as a diary, and there's lots of kind of archaeology in that early part of the book, which is then dug up in the later part of the book. So lots of signposts along the way for what might or might not happen. But it's Sarah's story of resistance, because I hate books where women are depicted as sort of like passive, wilting victims, especially Victorian women. And Sarah is a very heroic woman. She's very brave. She's willing to do what she can to save her son. And she writes this diary almost as a series of letters to her husband Samuel. So that's the early part of the book. And then we skip forward to the middle of the 20th century, and we meet Raina, who is a character who's born during apartheid. So she's born as a white person into a world of quite relative privilege and certainty. Apartheid is already on the wane, and which means that her privilege is on the wane, which means she has to work really hard to fight for her family as well. She has a daughter called Irma, and Irma has a son called Willem, who is the wee boy on the cover of the book. Willem doesn't really fit in. He prefers books and animals to people and to football. And Afrikaner society is very narrow, macho, toxic masculinity, and Willem doesn't fit into that at all. And Willem is sent by his parents because he doesn't fit in, because he's expelled from school after school, because they're worried about what's going to happen to him. Because in post-apartheid South Africa, he's born on the day Mandela's elected. You're not guaranteed privilege anymore just because you're white. So, he's going to have to find his own way in the world. And so they send him to this camp, and this camp is run by former soldiers, and they promise to make men out of boys. And it's really brutal, this camp. And there too, just as with Sarah in the first part of the novel, Willem has to survive. And just as Sarah makes a friend, Willem makes a friend too. And it's that friendship that gives him hope. And so what might initially seem to be unconnected stories, we soon realise are very connected, and something that happened 100 years ago has serious consequences for Willem in the here and now. So yeah, it's a book about hidden histories, really, and I think that's what you're looking at all the time. It's a book about how the past can affect the present, even and especially when we don't know about it, and how, without giving anything away, seemingly innocuous objects can hold great power.
Absolutely. And your character Willem is based on a real person, isn't he? I read.
Yeah, he's. Go on.
I read the story. I looked it up on the internet and read all about it. When I heard that I heard you talking about it, and you mentioned that it was based on an actual person. It's horrific, and these camps still exist. They're still there, aren't they?
Yeah. I mean, Willem is his character has more in common with me really than it does have with the real boy, whose story rather than whose character inspired this whole thing. I mean, if people want to go look up the story that you read, they can find it on The Guardian. Just search for my name and the name of the real boy, which is Raymond Boys, Buys. Raymond Boys was a 15-year-old boy who was sent by his mum and her boyfriend to a camp. Their real slogan is, "We make men out of boys." And what they do is they make bodies out of boys. I mean, these places are brutal, and several boys die there every year. Trigger warning that what happened to this boy was horrific. If you look at the pictures of him, you will think you're looking at pictures from Belsen. You really will, won't you, when you see the boy who came out of that camp is unrecognisable from the boy who went into that camp. And I was alerted to the story because it was thought that he was gay, and this was a conversion therapy camp. And indeed, there are many such conversion therapy camps in South Africa. In Europe, we think these things happen far away. They happen really close to us. They happen at home. But whether Raymond was gay or not, he was certainly a victim of homophobia. Everybody there thought he was gay. They called him a Moffie. Moffie is the name of this film, which had just come out, set in South Africa. After the book of the same name, it just means like queer or poof or whatever. And Raymond was a victim of homophobia, whether he was gay or not. And I was interested in him for that reason as a gay man, but also because he looked just like a friend of mine from when I was a boy who had come to my school in Scotland from South Africa. He'd been sent by his parents to Scotland for a year, and we became friends, and he went back to South Africa, and I'd never heard from him again until I saw this picture of a boy in the paper, and I was like, oh my God, it's him. Which was a real surprise, because it's not like I've thought I'd been thinking about him lots over the years and anything, but that was my emotional way into the story. And this, again, this was a story in the here and now about a boy. I start pulling at that thread, and suddenly I end up in, you know, in the Boer Wars in 1900, looking around myself going, where am I? How did I get here? And what's this world? And what's this history? And also, I don't know about you, but you probably knew all about the Boer War, but I knew nothing until I started researching it.
Not that much. I did know a little bit, but not as much as I know about the Second World War and the First World War. It's almost something. We're not taught, are we? Really taught about it at school.
No, I think because in some ways, but the First World War came along and was so big and swept away kind of everything that had gone before. But also, what happened during the Boer War was shameful, and it was shameful at the time. You know, then as now, European papers were reporting on what was happening in Britain, and being horrified by what they saw. And there were cartoons that you can find in the European press of the British Bulldog sort of like savaging, you know, children, Boer children, thin, tiny Boer women, and starving. And we knew they were starving at the time. And of course, Jacob Rees-Mogg said so on Question Time recently that it was an act of British generosity to feed and clothe these women and children. So, you know, it was a scandal at the time. And I think it's shame. I think a lot of it is shame. Yeah. You know, we won that war, but we weren't the heroes in that war. Whereas in the First World War and the Second World War, we get to be, rightly or wrongly, we get to be the heroes, right? But I think it's really interesting that, you know, Winston Churchill was kicking around during the Boer War. He famously broke out of prison. He was held in prison there. He was a war reporter. Kipling wrote a lot about the Boer War. Conan Doyle was a propagandist, really, for the British government at that time. So lots of names that we know now really were cutting their teeth, if you like. During Mahatma Gandhi was involved. Really, it was a global conflict because it involved an empire. And when I was on book tour in Australia and New Zealand and South Africa recently, it was really interesting to see how those countries think of the Boer War. If you look at their war memorials, the Boer War Memorial is often gigantic, really, really big. And it's because it's the first foreign war that those countries took part in. Mm-hmm. And they were called upon by empire, and so there's great national pride about taking part and answering the call of the mother country. And that war helped defining their national identity. Yeah. So I always look for the Boer War memorials, and if you start to look around, you know, if you're watching this and you're in the UK and you think, oh well, we haven't got one, you will have one somewhere. And it'd be really interesting, you know, to hear from you about where they are and what they look like, because they do exist. And where I live in Brighton, we've got a whole estate on the east side of the city, and the streets are called Mafeking Road, Kimberley Road, you know, named after all the towns and wars of the Boer War. And lots of towns and cities in the UK have these little estates that have got these South African names. The Boer War is like a stain on a wall. Once you see it, you can't stop seeing it, and it's kind of everywhere. And there were medals struck for the Boer War for the end of it. For the British were so confident it would be over in 3 months that they had medals made with the end date of the war on, which they had to melt down because it lasted 3 years.
And these camps, I mean, there were women, mainly women and children, weren't they? The men were off fighting, and the women were very resilient. You know, they wouldn't, they were very brave, very powerful women. But they were strange camps because they weren't really surrounded, as you'd imagine, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards or anything like that. They were really just sort of just kept there, and they didn't leave because they couldn't. And they were appallingly treated, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. In the Orange Free State, I think it was, the camps had no fences. They had instead white pebbles around the exterior to demarcate the camps, because the British general in charge didn't like seeing women and children behind barbed wire. It offended and upset him. So instead, they were kept behind these invisible barriers. And of course, you know, the climate and their health, the state of them, they were so weak, they were starved, they were dehydrated, they couldn't they couldn't escape. They couldn't go anywhere, and there was nowhere for them to go because of scorched earth. We destroyed all the farms. You know, and we also, you know, we also built these block houses, which you can still see in South Africa. You know, in the UK, you see sometimes those the bunkers, you know, that were built for the Second World War invasion. The pillboxes, yeah. In South Africa, you see the block houses, which are tall versions of that, and the country was segmented into, I think, 15 square mile chunks that were fenced off, and the British would go out and hunt the Boers and come home and boast about the size of their bag, like they were pheasants, like this was game shooting. And so there was nowhere for these women and children to go. So it created huge bitterness, and that's what I wanted to explore in the second part of the book, was like, you know, what plants, what people grow in scorched earth, you know, and how, you know, how can we find sympathy? How can we find empathy? How can we look at their human situation? You know, the people who are the victims in the first part of this novel, the pendulum swings and they become oppressors in the second part of the novel. And, you know, and I asked us as readers and as humans to look at that and to think about our own behaviour. You know, what would we do in a camp in 1900? What would we do in a camp now? You know, one of the reasons I wrote the book is because I want people to be aware that these camps still exist. People are still sending their boys there. It's always boys. And I would, you know, if one person reads or hears about this book and finds out what life is really like in these places for boys, that they don't send a boy and that they save a boy, then you know, then that's worth it. But it's very, you know, very nuanced. You have to look at history. I think Mark Twain said, wasn't it, history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And this is a book about those rhythms between the past and the present, the echoes that we hear, the things we just don't want to hear, those inconvenient truths, and the things that I learned along the way, you know. So yeah, it's fascinating, and you know, I'm so glad that you enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, it's at this point in my chats that I bring out an object from my cabinet of river curiosities, which is behind me.
It's stunning, your cabinet.
Thank you very much. And what fascinates me is the incredible breadth of objects that I found. And I can link these objects with the past, and I can very often find links. And so what I do is I try to find a link with my guest's book or whoever my guest is. And I have found a link with your book, a fantastic link. And I found this last year, and I know you're aware of it because I put it up on social media.
Yes, it's fascinating.
You went bonkers over it. So I've got it here, and I'm going to describe it because in case anyone's not watching this, I'll describe it first. So it is a glass bottle. It's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4. It's about sort of a strange sort of elongated octagon, I suppose. It's a sort of light aquamarine colour. It's about the length of my hand. And it's a fairly ordinary 19th century chemist bottle. And I find lots of these, and they very often have the name of the chemist on them. And they're quite interesting. They're very common. I found this out in the Estuary. And now the Estuary is the part of the river where around sort of the end of the Victorian period, the objects they were creating were designed to be thrown away. The Victorians created throwaway society. And so rather than people paying to go through the waste, they had this problem of mountains of waste they didn't know what to do with. It had no value anymore. And so they'd load it onto barges and they'd tow it out. And the London boroughs bought up swathes of Essex and Kent marshland, just deserted marshland, that they could dump all this Victorian waste into. So you very often find Victorian bottles out in the estuary on the foreshore that have washed out of some marshland that's being eroded out by the river. And that's where I found this. Now, what made me take it home and research it a little bit further was the name on it. And the name on here is W.H. Kerr. And it actually wasn't so much the name, it was the address. And it is number 9 New Bond Street. Now, most of the chemist bottles I find are from South London or North London or somewhere really not that interesting. Now, this is from New Bond Street, which is and was one of the poshest addresses in London. New Bond No, it's full of designer shops now. So I
Yeah.
popped onto Google Maps and I had a little look to see what's there now. And of course, it is a very, very expensive designer shop with a security guard outside. But when this bottle was issued, I should add, it's got these lovely little lines down here that are numbered that would be the dosage of whatever was sold. It would have been a tonic, probably. People believed a lot in tonics, that cure-alls that did everything, did nothing. So number 9 New Bond Street, when this bottle was issued in the sort of late sort of 1800s, was the chemist shop of W.H. Kerr, who was a chemist. Now, the interesting thing about him, and the thing that links him to your book and South Africa, is that W.H. Kerr at some point left this address and emigrated to South Africa to become a dispensing chemist in the Bloemfontein concentration camp, which is where your book is set. Now, the druggist and chemist I've got here, which was the trade paper of the time, was advertising for people. They were desperate for chemists to go out and work in these camps. And as you know, the disease, particularly amongst children, was just appalling. People were dropping like flies. And the druggist and chemist, their advertisement reads like this: "For the chemist in South Africa, there is a good deal to be had with comparatively little risk. It is difficult to draw quite as glowing a picture of life in this country as it deserves, for martial law, though quite necessary, is occasionally irksome." So for whatever reason, William Henry Kerr decided that life would be better for him in South Africa, so off he goes. And by the turn of the century, he is working as head dispenser at a refugee camp in Bloemfontein, which is the one you wrote about.
Yeah.
Now, he then appears in the writing that I found, in the papers that I found, on October the 31st. He is charged directly with the three deaths of 3 children. He kills 3 children. And how he does this, these children had bronchopneumonia as a result of measles, and that was very common. Measles was rife in the camps.
Yeah.
And very often they'd get pneumonia afterwards, and that's what killed them. And they were horribly malnourished. They had no ability to fight these diseases, and so many children died. He prescribed strychnine, a strychnine mixture for these children, but he made it too strong. He didn't tell the doctors and nurses that were dispensing it. He didn't advise them how to give the doses to the children, and 3 children died as a direct result. Now, what I can't find is any evidence that he was ever found guilty. I can't find any evidence of the punishment he was given, if any. And nothing mentioned. There's no mention of these children, their names. They're completely anonymous. They won't have a gravestone, and they'll be buried somewhere out there with all the thousands of other children in an anonymous grave out in the veldt. And what amazed me was this one bottle tells that really incredibly tragic story and has that direct link to your book.
That's incredible. That you know, that's a talisman that takes me right back to that time and that place. It's so ordinary looking, but it's just full of meaning and full of stories. And what makes me so angry about this is that, you know, we don't know what happened to him, and I'd love if somebody's watching or listening to this to find out if anybody does know what happened to him. Was he found guilty? But the lives of 3 Boer children would have been, you know, if there was some kind of exchange rate to that in British lives, it wouldn't have been anywhere near the value that was placed on the life of one British soldier. So, you know, those women and children, as you say, died like flies, and they were buried in these vast unmarked graves because the women needed to keep the wood to burn to purify the water so that they'd not get typhoid. So, you know what, you've got a choice, right? You build a coffin for the child who's died, or you take the wood and you build a fire to keep your other children alive. So these children started off with coffins, they ended up with shrouds, if that. The women weren't allowed to go and be by the funeral. They weren't allowed to see their children being buried because it was thought to be a security risk. It was thought they might escape or they might become hysterical, as women so often do, and ungovernable. And so they didn't even see their children be buried. And these are very religious, very, very religious women and mothers. And it was, to me, horrendous. I'm not surprised to hear that story. There were so many stories of cruelty, British cruelty, and so many stories of British kindness as well. And I came across those when I was in South Africa doing my research. But what's really clear to me is that we have not scratched the surface of this as a hidden history. Like, you know, think about how much you know about the First World War and the Second World War, how many books there are, plays there are, films there are, TV series there are. You know, we just don't really, there isn't the cultural memory in the UK of this period in time. And you know, those areas and those camps are out there. The graves are out there. They're out on the veld now, baking beneath the sun, and they're there, and they're not preserved. You know, they're not even respected, really. And I find that really sad. And we know very little about what happened in the black camps, other than the black people weren't given tents for free or food for free. They were charged by the British, you know, who evicted them in the first place, and they had to pay for it, and there was no way for them to earn money other than working as guards in the white concentration camps. And that's the first time in that country that you have black people having power over white people, and the white people get to the end of that war and they say never again, and then, you know, very quickly you get apartheid, which is the ramifications for the second part of the novel. So you know, I'm sure there are loads more objects that you will come across that have got connections to this period. Loads more stories to be found.
Well, you've visited the sites, haven't you?
Yeah.
And
I mean, the main one is the Bloemfontein one. That's where the Anglo-Boer War Museum is. Okay. So it's built on the site of the first camp, which was vast, huge camp. And there's a big wall there, which has got a big black marble wall with the names of people who've died. It's sort of like a mass grave. And I'd already decided on the names of my characters, and I went and I looked at this grave, and there on this massive gravestone, I found the names of my characters, which was terrifying. It was like ghosts, you know, and it's making me shiver actually thinking about it. But Sarah was there and Fred was there. The real life Fred was 2 years older than my Fred, but there they were, mother and son, and I just felt this astonishing sense of responsibility to these women and children in 1900, and to the boys in these camps now, that, like, you know, who's telling their stories? These are not voices that we hear from, and I felt like I had to try and give them a voice. But yeah, the Anglo-Boer War Museum is an interesting place, and it is full of those stories and artifacts. Again, seemingly ordinary objects, lots of bottles and jars, and family Bibles were a big thing, because these families were so religious. They would have family Bibles that would go back to, you know, 1600s, 1700s, and the British would often steal them, take them, because they were valuable and beautiful often, you know, and yeah, they take them. And so the Quakers have actually got a project, which I think is still going now, to return those family Bibles to South Africa. Yeah. So there are lots of objects which tell that story, and I found the museum very moving. And there at that museum there's a big obelisk, and under the obelisk are the ashes of Emily Hobhouse, who's this extraordinary British woman who I knew very little about. You know, this book would have been impossible to write without her heroism and her bravery. She went over there in 1900. She was sort of kind of aristocratic, doughty woman, friends with Millicent Fawcett, all the suffragettes and suffragists, and she couldn't believe the stories she was hearing, that, you know, that civilized people, i.e. white people, were being treated this way by British people, Christians. And she went and she saw the conditions in the camps. She wrote a book called War Without Glamour. She interviewed the women about what was happening to them. It's thanks to her that we know about scorched earth. It's thanks to her that, you know, we know about what really happened in the camps and how Byzantine and cruel they were. And she wrote back to the UK. Nobody believed her. She was hated. The Daily Mail ran a story about her with the headline, "Women, the Enemy." But eventually she was believed, and the death rate slowed, and charity went from Britain to South Africa, and lives were saved. But it took a long time. And we already knew what was happening. We shouldn't have been up to Emily Hobhouse to make us aware. But there is a museum opening to Emily Hobhouse in Cornwall because she was Cornish. Okay. Part of the reason for her interest in going out there was that so many Cornish tin miners had become soldiers, and she wanted to check on their welfare as well. So, but there is a museum opening to her. And I think, Anita Anand and other writers have talked about her recently, and I think we should all be as aware of her as we are of Millicent Fawcett. I mean, she opened a hospital in the First World War for German soldiers in Belgium. So she was a real humanitarian, but do we know about her? Do people? I've done umpteen events. I ask people, put your hands up if you know about her. They just don't know about her. But in South Africa, she's a hero. She's on the money, on the Rand notes. There's Hobhouse streets everywhere, and they named their only nuclear submarine the Hobhouse. So that's how tough she was.
Fabulous. So if we can just finish up, because I remember you told me a story about I'm all about really simple, ordinary, everyday things that can tell incredible stories. And you told me about the golden syrup tins.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's probably another link, actually, with the Thames, because obviously the Tate and Lyle factory is right on the Thames. So these were the tins that were being shipped out from Britain, and they were so important, weren't they, to the women out there?
Yeah, those tins were life-saving, actually life-saving, and you can still find them if you grub about out on the Veld where a camp was. If anyone has ever used or tried to get some of the syrup out of the tin, they'll know that it has an incredibly tight lid. And because of these incredibly tight lids, these tins were very valuable because you could fill them with your water ration, which was never enough, and you could snap the lid on, and it would be free from dust and filth and squalor, ash, all of those things. It could keep your water safe. So these tins, these very ordinary tins, which, as you say, had come all the way from England to South Africa, were life-saving water cans.
Brilliant. Well, Damian, thank you so much for coming and repeating the experience, because you're so interesting. And again, your book is fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I hope to catch up with you very soon.
That would be lovely. That would be absolutely lovely. And I'm hoping that we will, after all this is over, get the chance to actually go mudlarking together, because that is my dream.
Do you know what I was going to say to you, Damian? I will take you mudlarking when all this.
Will you really take me?
I will. I promise.
Honestly, I have been following your feed for years, and the thought of going there and finding a small Elizabethan pin, or an old bit of pipe, an old Georgian pipe, it's a dream.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Pinky promise.
Okay.
Pinky promise, I will take you mudlarking.
Thank you. That would be absolutely brilliant. I'm very excited about that. Thank you very much, Lara. And thank you for having me on and sharing that extraordinary object with me. It was so powerful. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that chat with Damian Barr. Just to remind you, his book is called You Will Be Safe. Completely left my mind then. You Will Be Safe Here. Also on YouTube are some of my other mudlarking chats. I've got Hallie Rubenhold, who is a historian and author of The Five, about the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. I've got Wendy Holden, who is the author of 100 Miracles, the incredible story of the woman who survived the Jewish concentration camps during the Second World War and went on to become one of the most renowned musicians of the 20th century. I've also got a chat with Dan Snow, where we talk about our trip mudlarking and discuss everything 18th century, including wigs. And coming up next week, I have got Professor Turi King, who is famous for genetically identifying Richard III, the skeleton that was found in the car park. And we will be discussing Fred. And if you don't know who Fred is a skull that I found last year on the estuary that is proving to being very, very interesting. So do join me again next week. I hope you enjoyed today. Goodbye.